It's Tuesday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me today, Labour MP Liz Kendall, Conservative MP and Boris Johnson backer Theresa Villiers, Josh Babarinde, who is a social entrepreneur, and the historian Neil Ferguson. So, what's going on today? Trick or treat from Boris Johnson?
My pledge is to come out of the EU at Halloween, on the 31st of October.
His opponent makes it about character.
The plan may be similar, the person's not.
Cracking gang violence one smartphone screen at a time.
You can either die or you'll be in jail, or you can think about working, making legit money.
And ramping up the pressure on Iran, diplomatic genius or reckless gamble?
Never can Iran have a nuclear weapon.
Let's pick up on questions about Boris Johnson's personal life and the row over the weekend with his girlfriend. Boris Johnson has said emphatically that these are private issues and that they are off limits. And yet, a loved-up picture of him and his girlfriend, Carrie Symonds, found its way into the press. Let's show our viewers two of the Conservative supporting papers who have the picture on the front page with headlines saying the Daily Mail, as he still refuses to discuss that row with lover Boris, and the Mills and Boon scene that takes us all for fools. And this in The Telegraph. The Daily Telegraph. Boris tries to keep the show on the road. Liz, has that photograph backfired?
Yes, because if you say you want to keep your private life private, you shouldn't be having pictures of yourself like that. And when he was asked today, did he know it was being taken, and he wouldn't deny it. So, you know, I'm not interested in who politicians go out with, what they call each other, what their wives or girlfriends wear. But I do think that if I had been a neighbour and I had heard what had gone on, I would have reported it to the police. And I feel very sad that so many people have jumped on that and attacked the neighbours, because there are many women in situations, I'm not saying it was in this one, but who have faced terrible circumstances, and I think it's right that people would have reported it.
Theresa, if the strategy was to draw a line under this affair, to coin a phrase, it hasn't worked, has it?
Look, the police were called to this incident. They found that there was no problems there. They consider the matter closed, I think.
But I'm talking about the picture that has, as I say, mysteriously found its way, what looks like a staged picture to some extent, of a love-struck couple after the weekend and all the reporting. Has that drawn a line under it all?
I do think it makes sense to move on. Boris has a strong track record to defend in terms of his time as Mayor of London, where he led from the centre ground, he delivered the Olympics, he cut crime. I think these are more important than photos finding their way onto the front cover of the newspapers.
Well, they're Conservative supporting newspapers. Why are they so sceptical?
It's I believe the story that what we need to be debating is the policies that the two candidates are putting forward.
I understand, but there must have been a strategy, mustn't there, for putting that picture out there?
I don't know
that it was leaked by his own side, and in fact he couldn't even say whether it was a recent picture or had been taken months ago. I mean, if you want to keep your private life private, keep it private.
The key question is, who is going to be the better Prime Minister, Jeremy Hunt or Boris? And I think Boris has the track record to deliver as Prime Minister, get Brexit done and help us move on as a country and boost our economy.
Is the strategy working?
Well, I think what can help us to answer that question is by analysing the character of the two people that want to be our next Prime Minister.
Well, that's what Jeremy Hunt would like.
Exactly. But I think that's what the country are doing. And if you look at what's happened here, Theresa talked about the photo kind of passively making its way on front of the newspapers. I don't think that that's the case at all. I think this boils down to a question of Boris's character, and what he's trying to do is use kind of his ego and his bombastic nature to distract from the fact that he doesn't have a credible policy platform to stand on. He doesn't have a plan for leaving the European Union on the 31st of October. He did not outline in his interview yesterday how that would happen.
And we're going to come to
that.
We're going to come to the policy initiatives and answers that Boris Johnson has put forward. But let's stick with this idea of character and whether this strategy from a sort of PR perspective worked, Neil.
Well, I have a sort of deja vu here because the ascent of Donald Trump was a checkered story, to put it mildly, with respect to his private life, and indeed at a critical moment in the 2016 election campaign, the famous Hollywood Access tape came out, revealing that the president had, at the very least, a relaxed attitude towards sexual assault, and it didn't turn out to matter. And I suspect that the same kind of argument applies here. Indeed, I already hear it from Boris's supporters. This isn't really going to stop him, because these questions of character are no longer decisive in politics in the way that they might have been in the past. I've known Boris since we were at Oxford together. I hate to admit it because it reveals that I'm as old as he is. And he was always, to put it mildly, flamboyant. But that's, to me, not the issue. The issue, and I agree with you entirely, the issue is actually the first part of the BBC interview, which made it clear that he has no credible answer to the question, how are you magically going to do what Theresa May couldn't do in 3 years with a tiny, tiny wafer-thin majority in the House of Commons? And there's no answer to that.
Well,
and I've yet to hear one from any of Boris's supporters. Could we please talk about that? It's much more important.
Well, we're going to ask Theresa Villiers in just a moment, but let's have a look at some of that interview, that sit-down interview with the BBC's political editor, Laura Kunsberg. In fact, on the very issue, Neil, that you have raised, the seemingly intractable problem of the Irish border.
But as one big solution to the Irish border question, which, as you suggest, is absolutely at the root of this, there is no solution ready right now.
You're right, Laura, that there's no single magic bullet, but what there is a wealth of experience, a wealth of solutions, and what's changed now is that there's a real positive energy about getting it done.
How does real positive energy solve the problem of the Irish border, Theresa?
Well, only yesterday we had a report setting out detailed plans about how you can use existing legal flexibilities and existing technology to deliver a border in Northern Ireland which is just as free-flowing and invisible and compliant as it is today.
But what's the real positive energy? We knew that before. That was already raised and already discussed at great length. What is the new thing here? What's the new ingredient? Real positive energy amounts to what?
I think the new ingredient is a determination to get on with Brexit. The Parliament has, after all, voted to leave the European Union. The legislation sets out that that will happen on the 31st of October. So unless Parliament is going to repeal revoke Article 50 and repeal the European Withdrawal Act, then we will leave on the 31st of October.
But how? What does he know that Theresa May didn't?
Well, I think one important thing that has changed is the European elections, where it was demonstrated that if the Conservatives don't deliver on the promise that we have made to respect the result of the referendum, then we will be punished at the ballot box. And that I think, is an important change that's happened in UK politics.
I'm afraid, positive energy isn't a political strategy. I mean, it's barely a title of a decent self-help book. The reality is, the technical solutions don't exist and won't for maybe a decade. You cannot separate out EU citizens' rights and the money that we owe from the withdrawal agreement, as he claims. You won't get an implementation period or a transition period unless you agree the withdrawal agreement. And the rest of the EU has said the withdrawal agreement is not up for negotiation. It is cloud cuckoo land. And I'm afraid it's not just Boris Johnson. It's Jeremy Hunt, who is also saying he would somehow be able to negotiate a better agreement because he was an entrepreneur. We have to wake up to this fact that we are not going to get those changes in the withdrawal agreement. You're not going to get the withdrawal agreement through the House of Commons. So you have two solutions, a general election or a public vote on with the withdrawal agreement, with Remain as the alternative option.
Well, can I say that there's another way in which we can look at how politics has changed, and that the last time Parliament had a vote to so-called take control of the order paper. The government won that vote by 11. And that was partly because 8 of your colleagues voted with the government, but it was also partly because another 15 or so decided to abstain, because they know
And it was a
that
Labour
they are being
motion
held
that
to
Tories
account
aren't
by
going to
their
vote for,
electorate
particularly
on terms of the
during a
result of the
Tory leadership
referendum.
Let's stick, though, with this idea of something different at play here that is going to unleash and unlock this dynamic.
Well, the only thing that matters is what's happened on the other side of the channel. We talk as if this is somehow up to British politicians, but from the moment that Article 50 was invoked, the initiative fell to the Europeans. The European 27 have not shown any sign whatever of being open to any changes in the withdrawal agreement. And so to talk about positive energy is mystifying to me. I've been recently on numerous occasions to the continent. I've met with leaders of key countries that were very sympathetic to Britain at the start of all this 3 years ago. For example, the Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte. Their impatience is very striking to me. It's not as if the energy has got better on the European side. It's got worse. They're really fed up with this. And the question that you hear discussed when you go to Europe is, well, are they going to come back and ask for another extension? And how long will the extension be? It can't be very long, and it's got to be in return either for an election or some commitment to another referendum. That's the reality of the atmosphere where it matters, which is on the continent.
What about the force of personality, though? I know you said that character and personality
thinking
doesn't have as much impact or on the electorate as it might have done. But he is different, Boris Johnson, to Theresa May.
Yes, he's more unpopular on the continent. He is more despised by European leaders. His record as Foreign Secretary entirely blew his credibility on the continent. That's the only real difference in personality that matters.
Well, I don't accept that. But also another thing that's different now is that under Theresa May's premiership, the EU never thought that we would be prepared to leave without a withdrawal agreement. If you cannot walk away from a negotiation, you get given a bad deal.
It's no more credible with
changed
Boris.
now.
It's possibly even less credible than it was before, and that's why this is all magical thinking. Somehow, because we're committed to leaving on Halloween, the Europeans are going to fold.
Right.
Dream on. It's not going to happen.
Jeremy Hunt. Well, Liz says Jeremy Hunter said he's an entrepreneur. You're an entrepreneur. Can entrepreneurs unlock this then? Does it make a massive difference?
I don't think that by being an entrepreneur or a doctor or whatever else it might be, you kind of gain some magic skill that enables you to overcome the arithmetic in the House of Commons. It enables you to go against what the EU has said about not reopening the withdrawal agreement again. And also, it doesn't equip you with the skill to defy time. You know, very shortly, Parliament's going to go on recess for the summer. We then have the party conference recess, which means that there are just going to be a few weeks in October for all of this stuff to happen, for the withdrawal agreement to be renegotiated, for the Irish backstop problem to be sorted. Boris is claiming that a lot is going to happen, but he hasn't said how. Right. And something that he said in that interview, he said that he would rely on creative ambiguity to get him through.
That was to do with the payment, I think, of the £39 billion divorce settlement. But yes, creative ambiguity by its very definition is ambiguous. Let's pick up on Theresa Villiers' point about the fact that you think he really means it about leaving at the end of October, come what may. Let's have a listen.
If you cannot get the agreement, that sounds like you crossing your fingers. You are clear, we would leave, you would take us out at Halloween without a deal. An absolute guarantee? You
have to be, of course. My pledge is to come out of the EU at Halloween, on the 31st of October. And the way to get our friends and partners to understand how serious we are is finally, I'm afraid, to abandon the defeatism and negativity that has enfolded us in a great cloud for so long, and to prepare confidently and seriously for a WTO or no deal outcome. Now, you've got to understand, Laura, listening to what I just said, that is not where I want us to end up. It is not where I believe for a moment we will end up. But in order to get the result that we want, in order to get the deal we need, the commonsensical protraction of the existing arrangements until such time as we have completed the free trade deal between us and the EU that will be so beneficial to both times. The commonsensical thing to do is to prepare for a WTO exit.
Theresa, do you trust Boris Johnson 100% to keep his pledge to come out of the EU on Halloween, come what may?
I do trust him to come out on the 31st of October. I think that's the important thing that we need to do. I speak regularly to people on both sides of this debate, and so many people are just fed up with the defeatism, with this being dragged out, with the deadlock. I think we need to just get on with it.
Right, he said, you know, come what may, do or die, I will not rest until we get out by October the 31st. He said that in a talk radio interview this morning. As I say, is that a cast iron guarantee? No wriggle room?
There doesn't sound like there's any wriggle room at all, and I believe that it is important that we do leave the European Union because we promised to do that in our manifesto. We've got to get on with it.
It's extraordinarily worrying for my constituents who
So you
work
believe him
in the food industry.
But do you believe Boris Johnson when he says that?
I do believe that. I don't want to see 20% tariffs on some food and beverages, you know, huge employers in my constituency, 10% on cars, 35% on dairy products. All the uncertainty for our security arrangements, I think it is completely irresponsible, and Parliament will not allow that to happen. There will be an opportunity for Parliament to express its view about no deal, and there is no majority for that. He has no mandate, and it would be wrong for the country, and it is completely appalling that he's suggesting he would do it.
A problem is that leaving the European Union, as Boris wants to, on the 31st of October, hits his kind of personal target, but it misses the point. What it doesn't resolve is that there is still going to be an issue with the Irish border once we've crashed out of the European Union on WTO terms, or whether we find another way. And what we need is a Prime Minister who's willing to look for a longer-term settlement for resolving this, not just something that's going to appease the right wing of the Conservative Party come Halloween.
Why don't you believe him, Neil, when he says he will leave? He'll absolutely...
Because it's what you say in order to win the contest to become leader, and then, and Boris has done this many times in his life, you say, oh, well, when I said that I was going to leave on October the 31st on Halloween, what I was actually striving for was an improvement in the atmospherics, and we're going to nevertheless... and so on. And I've seen this movie umpteen times in his career, and I think Conservative members, members of the Conservative Party, need to be aware that there's absolutely no plausible way in which he crashes the country out on WTO terms. A, it would be enormously economically disruptive. I've yet to hear any credible answer to the question, how does this not crater the economy? And B, I think he doesn't have the parliamentary arithmetic to do it anyway. So it's all a bluff. I don't know why we're even taking it seriously.
I mean, imagine what that is doing to businesses and my constituents and EU citizens. I mean, we are not the plaything of Boris Johnson's ambitions.
Well, first of all, is it deliverable?
I believe a WTO exit is deliverable. I believe an exit on the 31st of October is deliverable. I very much hope that there will be a deal with the EU, a standstill arrangement on tariffs, but if they're not prepared to be reasonable, then we still have to leave. The country voted to leave. If we turn around and say, oh, no, sorry, we think you got it wrong the first time round, we're not going to do it after all.
They didn't vote to leave.
That would cause,
with a no deal,
I think, a
and all the
real
damage.
collapse in confidence in the democratic process and in both the two main parties, both of which we went, Labour and Conservative, went into the last general election promising to implement the result of the referendum. Therefore, we cannot continue with these indefinite extensions. We have to get on with it.
But, Theresa, the evidence at the moment from your own Conservative colleagues is that they would block no deal, and they'd block it by actually being prepared to vote in a no confidence motion against the new Conservative government. We've heard it from Ken Clarke, we've heard it from Dominic Grieve, it's been implied pretty fairly by Philip Hammond, the Chancellor, by Amber Rudd, and there are at least, says Tobias Ellwood, 12 of your colleagues who will be prepared to vote down no deal in the form of a no confidence motion. So I say to you again, he can't deliver it.
I don't believe, when it comes to it, that my Conservative colleagues would vote to inflict a general election and potentially a Jeremy Corbyn government on the country over the issue of whether we leave with a deal or without a deal. I believe that a government led by Jeremy Corbyn would be deeply damaging for this country, and therefore an early general election is a huge risk. And that is an argument I would put strongly to my colleagues. Whatever their view on a no-deal exit, they should be aware that a huge amount of preparation has gone into preparing for WTO terms. We trade on WTO terms with most of the rest of the world. Most of the world's trade is done on WTO terms. There will be potentially disruption. But I think there has been a huge exaggeration about the nature of a no-deal exit.
Right, well, we'll talk about that in a moment in terms of the economic consequences.
Can I just say, though, Jo, you know, the Conservative government has already inflicted a general election on us a couple of years ago that resulted...
And people were fed up at having an early general election. They don't want another
that resulted
early one.
in a minority government that's responsible for the instability that we have right now. And I think what politicians have proved over the last 3 years is that you, very sadly, aren't capable of resolving this issue. And you seem to be able to trust the public to make a decision back in 2016. And Boris said in his interview in the last few months, a lot has changed, he said, since the 29th of March in politics. Well, a lot has changed in the last 3 years. And I think that the public need to decide, in light of those changes, what happens next. It's an absolute disgrace that our country is being dragged through indecision that's been caused in the Conservative Party, and I'm afraid in the Labour Party as well. Enough is enough. The public, I trusted them before, and I would trust them again to get us out of this mess.
Let me pick up on one sentence from the clip we just heard from Boris Johnson, where he refers to the commonsensical protraction of the existing arrangements until such time as we have completed the free trade deal between us and the EU that will be so beneficial to both sides. That is what he is relying on in the event of no deal. What is the commonsensical protraction of the existing arrangements, Theresa?
Well, that's what's known as a GATT24 standstill arrangement. So it's a very basic outline agreement which says we maintain our current tariff relationship as it is, pending agreement on a full free trade agreement.
What evidence have you got that we could continue to trade on that basis with the EU, as we do now, if we leave without a deal?
Well, because it's in the interest of both sides that we continue on a free trade basis, not least because the EU sells considerably more to us.
But the EU would have to agree, wouldn't they? It would have to be mutually agreed, and they have already said they won't do it, and they're not the only ones. You even had the International Trade Secretary, Liam Fox, who has said that the claim that we could trade in the way we do now in the event of no deal just isn't true.
Well, no one's making the claim that you could have the GATT standstill arrangement without the agreement of the European Union. It is a matter that needs to be agreed.
Well, they've said they won't do that.
Well, we'll see. It's never actually been put to them. That was one of the problems with the May negotiations, for example, on things like alternative arrangements for the Irish border. They were never properly pursued. A GATT24 standstill arrangement hasn't been pursued with the EU. Let's get someone elected who will ask them.
Right, except Sabine Wayand, who has been critical to the negotiations on the EU side, has said the answer is no.
She is one individual who I gather is moving to a different position anyway, but it continues to be in the interest of both sides that we have a close trading relationship. It's not in anyone's interest that we start erecting tariff barriers, and therefore I think it's important
zero tariffs on all goods, zero tariffs applied in the case of the EU and every other state that we trade with.
Look, the government has published plans for future tariffs. Some of which would be reduced, some of which would be maintained, but I believe that it continues to be in the interest, in an ideal world, that we maintain free trade with the EU from the start. If we did have to leave on WTO terms, it would be very important to continue the negotiations with a view to concluding a Canada-style free trade arrangement as soon as possible.
We're going round and round and round, and I agree with Josh on this. Parliament is not going to pass withdrawal agreement. The EU is not going to change it. There are only two ways out of this. And instead of wasting all of this time, putting businesses and EU citizens and our citizens abroad, putting them in a terrible situation, we have got to break the deadlock. And you either do that by a general election, or you do it
breaking the deadlock means that we leave. We have to leave.
A public vote. Because what is on offer now is so very different from what was promised during the referendum. And the sooner we are clear about that, the better.
All right, we're going to move on to the final clip that we want to show our viewers and guests from Boris Johnson, and this is him talking beyond Brexit.
But be in no doubt that at heart I am a centre-right, progressive, modern conservative, and I will govern from the centre-right because that is, and from the centre because that is where you win. That is where the broad mass of the people of this country are. They understand that you need a dynamic market economy to pay for fantastic public services and infrastructure. And you need fantastic public services and infrastructure, great NHS, great education, to enable business to have the confidence to invest.
Now, one of the proposals that has come out beyond Brexit is a tax cut, a £9 billion tax cut for the 10% of top earners. Does that sound like someone governing from the centre ground?
Sounds like somebody trying to win a Tory leadership contest, and again, it doesn't really have any basis in fiscal reality, nor I think would it be in any way an advantage to the Conservatives in the election that eventually will come, even if it doesn't come as quickly as I think it will. It's got to come sooner or later. 2022 is not far away. So I think this is another position that Boris will trap, should he win, that he will simply drop in the period between his becoming leader and the next election.
Right.
Because I think you have to remember that on present trajectory, the Conservatives are going to lose heavily in the next election unless the Brexit Party is disbanded and Nigel Farage endorses Boris Johnson, which seems to me highly unlikely to happen. We're in the midst of a major realignment in British politics. Ironically, British politics is becoming more like continental politics, with lots of parties and only coalitions possible. Even at the moment, we keep telling ourselves that we're leaving. But that's the reality. So I think any position that Boris takes now will have to be jettisoned with a view to the next election, and I think he will lose the next election, because I think the Conservatives are in an almost extinction-type scenario, given the speed with which the Brexit Party has risen up.
What do you make, though, of his claim to literally rule as he did as London mayor? He wants to invest in public services. He was, by his own admission, popular with parts of the electorate in London, socially liberal. Would you be a fan of that?
Well, I think what's interesting is that Boris described himself as a modern progressive Conservative. And I don't think there's anything progressive about the tax cuts for the richest in our society that he's proposed. Nor do I think is there anything progressive or modern about him comparing people who wear veils to letterboxes or bank robbers, about him describing Commonwealth people in Africa and elsewhere as pickaninnies or with watermelon smiles, nor is there anything modern or progressive about talking about spaffing money up the wall in relation to historic child abuse inquiries. There is nothing modern or progressive about that man, and I think that renders him unfit to be our next leader.
Teresa.
He demonstrated as London mayor that he does lead from the centre ground. And as for the ideas on raising the threshold for the higher rate of tax, is it so wrong to want, head teachers and GPs and senior police officers just to keep a little bit more of what they earn? I think we need also to recognise that to have a competitive economy, actually reducing taxes can have a positive effect. But I am absolutely certain that whatever tax changes Boris introduces if he becomes Prime Minister will also be providing advantages for those on low incomes, because they are a big priority.
We're going to move on because Josh Baberinda here is a social entrepreneur, and you founded Cracked It, which was set up for young people at risk. Let's have a look at your film.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, past it was very stressful because I'd have to always look about for the police thinking could there be a warrant out for my arrest? The whole knife situation, I was always just carrying obviously the paranoia of everything, of course, until one day I got myself caught with one. This how I found Cracked It, as a matter of fact. So that's what changed my life around.
So Cracked It is London's social enterprise tech repair service staffed by young ex-offenders and young people at risk of offending. And our mission is to harness the tech repair market, worth about £2 billion a year in the UK, for the purposes of crime prevention. So the tech repair market is huge. 29% of people have done something like this to their device. They've smashed it. And we've been able to harness it to create something really positive for some of the most vulnerable young people in our society.
I was seeing everybody make money in the area, and I kind of just thought, why can I not do this? It's the most easiest way. It's the quick way of just getting out. So I started to fall into that type of crowd, and then it got into a lot of trouble. That does feel good as well. Then I can walk down the road with my own money. When you're obviously doing the lifestyle, you do obviously make money from it, but it goes quickly because you have to think about where that money's got to go. Obviously, it gets spent quickly, but knowing that you can check your bank account and knowing that you've got your legit money going inside, you feel like somebody. You don't feel like you're worthless because making money in the street, you feel worthless. You feel low in life. It's not something that people do just to have fun. It is difficult just to like up and leave it one day because you're scared of the consequences that could possibly happen to you. Like if you're dealing and you're working for somebody, have to tell the person that you're not doing it anymore can come as like a shock that you don't want to do it. It is difficult, but you can make it easier if you have support. You can either continue doing this lifestyle and end up in two ways. You can either die or you'll be in jail, or you can think about working, making legit money and better your life. Yeah. Here's your phone, it's brand new.
Yeah.
So
very good. Josh, what inspired you to start Cracked It?
Well, a few years ago I was volunteering as a youth worker in East London and came across lots of young people who were involved in crime or at risk of being involved in it, who felt pushed or backed into crime's corner because legitimate employment in many ways wasn't offering them the income, belonging or self-worth that they were looking for. And I was determined to develop some kind of intervention that would support them to move towards employment, which would help give them those things and move away from crime in the process.
What should the government or what should governments be doing in order to help people like Tariq?
I think what's really important is that governments invest in youth services. Youth services aren't just about PlayStation or pizza or kind of ping pong at youth clubs. They're about way more than that. They're about giving people safe spaces to withdraw from criminal activity or withdraw from negative influences, but also about having workers who are attached to them who can help them navigate their way through adolescence and towards adulthood. Unfortunately, we've seen in some areas youth services cut by up to 91% across the UK as a result of cuts that have been made to local government budgets from the centre. So this is one thing that's really important. Another thing is that we need to make sure that we invest in our police services properly. Police, yes, play an important role in apprehending criminals, but what they also do is they build really great relationships with the community with a view to preventing crime from happening. And we've seen the loss of 20,000 police officers across the UK over the last decade or so.
Is it about resources and heightened police numbers in order to deal with what has become the scourge in London, certainly, but in other cities too, of a rise of knife crime?
That would seem a reasonable inference from the American experience, and we were just talking before we went on the air about your recent trip to LA. There's an extraordinarily impressive African-American economist named Roland Fryer at Harvard who's been working hard on solutions to these problems, and in many ways the problems are much worse in American cities where the gangs have guns, not just knives. And I think the key lesson here is that you're, in a sense, bringing a private sector solution ultimately to the problem, because social enterprise is about getting people into work, and that's where you've hit on a winning solution. It's really hard to get young men like Tariq to rest content with being on unemployment benefit, giving them some purpose in life and giving them, as he beautifully put it, legit money. That's the key, and I think that's in line with a lot of recent American research like Roland Fryer's.
It's about hope that if you do work, you can get a job that will pay your bills, give you something else to enjoy your life, that there is some alternative. And as well as the police, the neighbourhood policing and the youth services, which I think are essential, I would say we really need to think even earlier, because if gangs are grooming people at age about 12 to go into them, you've got to start really young, and that's what we're trying to do in some parts of Leicester with our Police and Crime Commissioner, to get to the very early ages to say what are the problems with having a knife, but also for kids who might be excluded from school, giving them some other training and other activities so that they don't get dragged down that route.
I mean, it's interesting that Boris Johnson has said today that he backs up Sajid Javid's view that there should be another 20,000 police officers, which is about the number that has been cut since 2010. Do you think that is a good proposal from both the Home Secretary and Boris Johnson?
Yes, it is. I mean, I think there's going to be a lot of consensus across this panel. Part of the solution to the problems we're seeing is greater investment in the police service, and there is another 970 million going in approximately this year. But I think as well as that, a particular campaign I have is that people who do find themselves involved in crime should be encouraged and supported to move on, just like the social enterprise we've heard about. But also I think our current system of criminal records is holding people back. We have one of the toughest systems for disclosure of criminal records in the developed world, and I want to see that change so people are not anchored to their past in the way the current system does.
Another real barrier that young people face in terms of kind of disengaging with old negative lifestyles and engaging with more positive ones are barriers to accessing the right kinds of mental health support. So a report done by the Mayor's Office for Policing and Crime a few years ago found that around 1 in 3 gang members in London have experienced depression, anxiety or suicidal thoughts. And I recently went to LA, as Neil said, sent there by the Winston Churchill Memorial Trust to look at how the city and how organisations in the city are tackling the issue of gang crime and violence in the city. And one of the kind of most important interventions that I saw deployed by Homeboy Industries, the world's largest gang intervention organisation, was this provision of wraparound support in the form of therapy to support these young people work on their mental health so that they are better able to disengage from those lifestyles and not relapse back into them when negative things happen in their life.
Thank you very much, Josh, and thank you for making the film. We are going to talk about something completely different. Neil, we're going to talk about your piece in the Sunday Times about Donald Trump's foreign policy. What was your thesis?
Well, it's generally the case that certainly in Western Europe and coastal America, everybody assumes that everything Trump does is rubbish. And this is a kind of conventional view from Berlin all the way through Battersea across to Cambridge, Massachusetts. And I tried to make the point that that's not quite right, that however you may dislike the president's personality, on key issues, he's actually having some quite significant success. Issue number one is China. Previous administration were essentially acquiescing in China's ascendancy. That was really how the Obama administration ended up thinking about it once their pivot to Asia had failed. And I think the trade war, it's a blunt instrument, has had a really quite impressive impact on Beijing and has put Xi Jinping's government very much on the back foot. I go to Beijing quite often. I'm a visiting professor at Tsinghua, and you would be really startled, I think, by how intimidated the Chinese elite now is and how anxious they are to get to a deal and how difficult they're finding it to deal with him. The other issue is Iran,
right?
Which
well, I'm just going to. Yes, I am eager for you to talk about, but I need to invite Leslie Vinjamura in, who is head of US and the Americas programme at Chatham House. Just as you get to Iran,
surprise guest.
Surprise guest, yes, waiting in the wings to come and sit next to you, because this idea that somehow has Donald Trump executed a sort of policy of restraint over Iran, or has he wimped out in terms of threatening some sort of retaliatory strike and then in the end deciding not to?
Well, this is fairly standard Trump tactics. He's not a war president, he's a trade war president. He likes to talk the talk, but I'd be very surprised if President Trump went to major military action in any of the countries that the US is confronting. Remember, fire and fury was a phrase that he used when the North Korean crisis was really reaching its boiling point. I was in Washington around that time, and I was startled to find that almost nobody in the White House was talking about war. They were talking about trade war. So I think we should recognise that part of Trump's technique at the moment is to make aggressive threats and then walk them back. He doesn't actually need a shooting war with Iran at this point. He just needs to keep Iran in its current position as bad boy of the Middle East so that the coalition that the US has built in the last few years, extending from Israel to Saudi Arabia, holds together during what is the early phase of yet another American American Middle East peace initiative. So I think it's silly to criticise Trump for not following through on military action. I mean, goodness knows, I'm kind of stunned by the people who can make this complaint. They're exactly the same people who would be outraged if he had followed through in this action.
What do you make of his statement?
I agree that it was the wrong position to get in, but it was certainly the right position to walk back from military action. But it's a very big gamble to think that you can, make Iran the bad boy, play very hard, and that nothing else will happen in that interval. Because of course, what we've seen is that the hardliners gain ascendance. The appetite from Iran for any kind of return to talks has diminished, certainly with the second round of sanctions. To put sanctions on the foreign minister Zarif, the moderate who was so critical to those earlier negotiations, is in my view just simply foolish. And it's very hard to make the argument that the tough tactics will actually have any kind of success with respect to Iran. On China...
Oh, I don't think, by the way, that they're expected to have. The point is not Iran, the point is everything else. The point is actually maintaining that coalition that I mentioned that extends from Israel to Saudi Arabia and getting it to deliver something on the Palestinian question. I don't think anybody in Washington expects Iran miraculously to change its behaviour.
Well,
I don't think that's the point.
Tough to see what it delivers on the Palestinian question. I mean, we're seeing this, the rumours of this peace plan. The Palestinians
Well, it's not a rumour. There is one.
Well, there's a peace plan that has at its heart the assumption that you can win over the Palestinians and solve the peace problem between Israel and Palestine by paying them off, right? By making it an economic problem.
Another deal.
Made it very clear. It's a political problem.
Absolutely.
The political solution needs to be out front.
That's novel. And people in the foreign policy establishment are very disapproving. Of course, they have a low opinion of Jared Kushner. But actually, it's not a bad idea to get money from the Gulf to the Palestinians. We know from the Arab Spring that the key constituency in Arab countries is small business. If you can get money to flow to people in the West Bank, particularly Gaza, is more difficult, then I think you might be surprised. So my point is, most people give this a 0% probability, and I think that is much too low. It's by no means a 0% probability. And it almost helps the Trump administration that people have such low expectations. But I think this is the strategy. Phase one is undoubtedly bribe them, pay them to go away, to turn away from terrorism. And phase two is going to be the difficult part, because with the Israeli government not formed after Bibi Netanyahu's election win, it's not quite clear who the Israelis will be, who will be representing Israel in the political part.
Okay.
But I think the economic part is by no means a bad idea.
Where's the UK government in any of this? I mean, that's one of my questions is, the immediate issue is how do you de-escalate the situation? We've got to
with Iran.
Yes, but we have to find a way out for both the Americans and the Iranians to de-escalate. I would like to see much more active diplomacy from this country, including with our European allies. And I do have to say, I am worried that our Foreign Secretary's attentions are elsewhere and that we've only sent a junior minister to Tehran. I mean, I think our commitment to international institutions is really under threat across the board, and I'm very worried that Britain is absent from the pitch.
I hope that you're right, Neil. I hope that Trump is a genius.
Oh, I didn't say that. I by no means think that. But I think it's important to recognise that he's not king, and policy is not just being made by him, it's been made by Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, it's being made by John Bolton.
De-escalate the situation in Iran, or has it, in a way, by economic sanctions, just made it just as bad,
Well, I think
really?
he's a risk taker. Trump is a risk taker, and he prides himself in that kind of behaviour and that kind of attitude, and I really hope that he knows what he's doing, because this could backfire and lead to really...
Iran has said it will breach limits of uranium levels within days.
And it's also, I mean, it's very interesting, right, to listen to this panel as sort of taking a pro-Trump view, given that what Trump has done is effectively marginalized Europe from this process. Europe, which was absolutely central to negotiating the peace deal, that's wanted to keep it alive, that's been working so hard, so discreetly, in the face of a president who is increasingly making it virtually impossible for Europe to maintain any kind of independent stance.
That makes perfect sense, since the Europeans are the ones eager to trade with Iran and eager to remove the economic pressure
that
the regime in Tehran is currently under.
Was working.
Well, I think that's a highly...
Hang on, don't all talk over each other. Let Leslie come back.
That the deal was working. It might have been working in slowing down Tehran's pursuit of nuclear weapons, but it wasn't working in any other respect. In fact, if anything, the Iranians regarded themselves as having carte blanche to pursue conventional and terrorist tactics.
Leslie, the final one. Hang on.
With the UN inspectors, right, who went in time after time and said, Iran is complying with the terms of the deal. Nobody said that the terms of the deal were other than to extend the breakout time and to limit the nuclear program.
Which was the problem with the deal.
Which is better than the alternative, right? Politics is about alternatives, certainly better than the alternative.
Well, and on that, from all of us here, bye-bye.
Ta-da! Yeah, well, that ended really quickly today. I don't know why, but it seemed to go really quick. Maybe because I wasn't paying any fucking attention whatsoever. The side chat was more fucking funny than this fucking show is sometimes. God damn it. Anyway, I will be back later. Did I do Newsnight yesterday? I can't remember. Can't fucking remember. I don't know. I'll check. And if I haven't, I'll be back in a minute with Newsnight. Probably. Politics. Fucking... Blech.